Thank you again. And so, yeah, as Danielle said, this session is titled It's Not You, It's Me, Breaking Up with Outdated Beliefs Using the Social Model and Disability Rights. So, today, what I hope that we're going to be able to cover is that we're going to explore the ways in which we conceptualize and that we think about disability, and importantly, how this affects the delivery and why we do the work that we do, supporting people with disabilities. So, with that, before I take a quick moment to give you some more background on myself, I want to just state that I'm here today speaking to you because of the advocacy and research and activism that a lot of disabled people before me have worked really tirelessly to accomplish. And I also want to say that what I'm going to be presenting on today, I've been engaging with and studying with for only about 3 years. I say only, it seems like a long time, but actually, it hasn't been that long. And it's still been a really, really profound shift for me to ground the work that I do every day, and to kind of challenge the way that I might have first learned about disability or been socialized to think about it. So I did want to mention that on this slide. So again, I'll just be really quick, give you some background about what I'm bringing with me into this space. So there's my photo. I'm wearing glasses in this session. And again, my name's Allie. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a 2019 alum of the University of Minnesota, where I earned my bachelor or my master's degree in human rights. I also hold bachelor's degrees in nonprofit leadership and international studies. And I currently work at LifeWorks on our new business development team. And I have about 4 years of experience working across many settings across disability services sector, ranging from direct support roles and outdoor recreational programming for children and teens with intellectual disabilities, to also international disability rights programming and projects. And I'm just really excited to be able to, again, share this space with you today, and have this important conversation, because I really deeply believe that in order to advance true disability inclusion, so what my team and I at LifeWorks are trying to do, that also, instead of working with community and employer partners, it's also disability service professionals and organizations ourselves who, I think it's really important that we be willing to learn about topics like this, and topics like ableism and intersectionality and disability identity and culture, as well as principles of disability justice. So again, I'm just really happy to share this space with you all. And I'll quickly share some brief background about the organization I'm here representing today. So LifeWorks is a service provider based out of Eagan. We were founded in 1965, and our mission is to serve our community and people with disabilities as we live and work together. We offer a diverse range of services and supports, ranging from employment, community-based, and in-home and fiscal management services for people with disabilities and their families. And for 55 years, we have worked alongside people with disabilities to remove barriers to inclusion. And on my team at LifeWorks, we're taking our lessons that we've learned in those 55 years, and we're working directly now with disability organizations, employers, and community partners to further advance disability inclusion in our workplaces and our communities. So before we get really started in today's session, I want to just quickly introduce some goals and kind of our plan for the day. So we're going to kind of interchangeably, we're going to learn about these models of disability. We're just going to focus on 4 of them, and we can talk about it later, that there's a lot other ones too that we won't get to cover today. We're going to do a really broad overview and high level look at some disability history. And as we do that, I want us to be thinking about and consider why disability service professionals typically aren't required to learn more about disability history and culture. So just keep that in the back of your mind as something that I want us to think about. And then finally, I want us to be able to kind of create plans for how we're going to be able to sustain engagement with the social and human rights models and these more progressive lenses for disability inclusion. And I wanted to take a moment to offer maybe some definitions or a grounding understanding of how I understand disability as I'm entering into the space with you. So I have on the slide here that disability is a natural part of human variation, and it's just really a normal reflection of human diversity, and that we're all made up different ways. I also know that disability is a lived experience, and I'm going to talk about this more later, this third bullet point, but that disability is caused, in my understanding, by disabling societal barriers, not by individual differences of folks' bodies and minds. And I also understand disability as diversity itself, and that no two people experience disability the same way. Disability, I also understand it as the most intersectional of all minority groups, and that people with disabilities make up the only identity group that any person, regardless of various markers of diversity, so any person regardless of age, gender identity, race, class, sexual orientation, you name it, people with disabilities make up that only group that any person can join at any time. And I also have up on here the term TAB, temporarily able-bodied. So that has been foundational for me to think about disability and kind of really the lies that we're taught about disability throughout our socialization process, maybe as we are growing up or we're just, interacting with people in the community. And then I also want to make a quick note on language, as I'm trying to be intentional and really think critically about how we use language. So you might notice that throughout this talk, I may utilize both identity first language and person first language. And I do this purposefully in a small attempt to recognize that while many people with disabilities do experience disability as an essential or integral part of their individual identity, other people don't, and that's okay. And there is actually a shift happening in the disability community towards identity first language, but I'm really here to, I'm not saying that there's any right or wrong language to use when we listen to the preferences of a disenfranchised group themselves. So I'm really not trying to label or define someone else's experience of disability. Here, I will pause to say that I myself come into this space as a person with a disability. I have multiple non-apparent mental health disorders. And so I do come into this space with that lived experience, but even being a part of this identity group, I cannot speak for other people's experience. I can speak about my own experience. And again, like I said, my disabilities are non-apparent. So we'll talk more about this later when we get to the social model. But for me, the social model has been really transformative in how I can better understand my own experience as well as my own privilege. So because my disabilities are not apparent, I actually have the privilege of deciding when and where and to whom I disclose my disability. In part, that's because I believe I'm not disabled by society. And again, we'll talk more about this later, but I mean here, is that I'm not discriminated against, I'm not segregated, and I'm not prejudged by society, and that I air quotes pass for being non-disabled in most spaces that I come into. So speaking of non-disabled, I will also likely use that term to talk about people without disabilities. And I also do this intentionally, following the lead of disabled activist Heather McLean, who has said that they use non-disabled as language to center a group who is not typically centered. So the way I think about this too is comparing it to race, is if instead, similarly, instead of saying, if we said white, a group that is typically centered around conversations of race, we instead centered a disenfranchised group and said non-Black. So that's just a quick note on language and how it's important, but how also I might be talking about things throughout this presentation. So when I submitted my presentation proposal in the description, I wrote that in the last 100, 200 years, there have been really drastic changes in society's response to people with disabilities and disability itself. I think that we'll talk about it later, but it's also paralleled by evolving conceptual models or evolving thoughts, how we think about disability and how we interact with people with disabilities. Again, I have here on the slide that even though a lot has changed, it's not disability that's changed. Disability is, I said it before and I'll keep saying it, it's a natural and normal part of life. And it has not changed throughout history, and it will always be with us. But instead, what has changed is society. And I think that this highlights really the power of the social model, or the potential of the social model, in being able to ground our future work in knowing and acknowledging that society can change, but also that we must change to be more accessible and inclusive to people with disabilities. So we're going to quickly cover some, again, this really high level history of disability history. So I have on here some bullet points under some different eras or years in US history. And I will just go very quickly for sake of time over it, but I'm happy to, to talk about it in the chat or the questions at the end. But really here, I'll go over that. Really to start, that the 1800s were not that long ago. We do talk about it like it was a long time ago, but it really wasn't very long ago in the broad history of the world. So just remember that. But so not very long ago, things like institutionalization and forced sterilization and really intentional segregation of people with disabilities, all human rights violations, were not only common, but they were encouraged as standard practices. And when we look back to the early 1800s, especially, social attitudes towards disabled people could be summarized as compassionate education. So there's a lot of focus on charity, and these poorhouses were established for people in poverty at that time. A lot of social reform. If you can remember back to your high school history classes, you might have talked about poorhouses. And it was at this time in the mid 1800s that the country's first special or training schools for people with specific disabilities were established. So maybe it could be a training school for the blind or a school for the deaf. Those were starting to pop up in different parts of the country. However, even though these schools started with a really strong educational focus, the demand soon grew, and they were no longer able to really fully educate and teach every student. And so during this time, the focus started to turn from education to more of like containment. So I have a quote from the governor of Massachusetts, who in 1883 said, "Give them an asylum with good and kind treatment, but not a school." So we kind of see the shift again from education to more of containment. And it was also at this point, I have here the word eugenics. There was a lot of, you can go and research it if you're interested. I think it's hard to study, but it's an important thing that we recognize that different, I have scientists in quotation marks in the 1800s and 1900s began doing experiments and studies of like studying the shape of the skull to talk about different characteristics and functions. They were classifying different types of developmental disabilities based on how much of a quote threat they were to the advancement of the human gene pool. So even though I say they were quote scientists, I think we should remember that at the time, these were actually really well-respected doctors, scientists, professionals whose views really influenced this fearful and dehumanizing responses from individuals and communities towards people with disabilities. And so in a really short time, we moved from education to containment and fear and dehumanization. And the rise of institutions really reached their peak in this 1950s, 1960s, 1970s in the US. But also around that time, the US experienced what we call now the parents movement. So it is made up of many individuals and organizations who were fighting for deinstitutionalization. At the same time, though, there were parents in that movement who were focused on simply improving or reforming the existing system of institutions. But also at the same time, it's important to remember that many other parents did not want to put their children in institutions at all. And as a personal note, this is exactly how LifeWorks came to be founded in Dakota County in 1965. But as these families did not want to maybe put their family members or children into institutions, there were little to no services in their communities for people with disabilities. So if no services were available, this is when we see really the field of disability services, the modern disability services system that we know and that we work in today. That's when around this time, with a little bit of variation, that's when this system really began to emerge and take shape. And then we move into the 1970s to around 1990 and beyond. And this period was marked by really disability-led activism for non-discrimination and equal rights. So that started in federally and publicly funded programs. You might have heard of, for example, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, or you might have heard of the subsequent 504 sit-ins that happened in 1977. A quick plug, if you have not yet seen the movie documentary Crip Camp on Netflix, they do a really great job of talking about specifically that act of activism and also others that, that were happening around this time period. And we'll talk more later too when we touch more on disability rights, but really, I want us to keep in mind that before disabled people fought for and demanded their rights, disability discrimination was really rampant. So things like public transportation wasn't accessible. There were no curb cuts in sidewalks. News media and information did not have to be made accessible to people with sensory impairment. So I want us to be thinking of all the other things in our world today that would be missing if people with disabilities had not demanded their equal rights. And speaking of demanding, we'll talk again more later, but just it's been important for me to remember that civil rights laws such as the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that we, I think, all know that we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of, we did in July. The ADA did not come out of the goodness of the hearts of those in power, but rather it had to be fought for, and it was hard work, and it people sacrificed for those rights. And so we'll touch more on it later, but I've been really thinking, and my team at LifeWorks have been thinking about what our responsibility working in this system and in this sector, what our responsibility is to honor both the sacrifices that were made in the past, but also to honor the rights and dignity of the people who we serve in our programs and services today. So this was a super quick overview. A lot of the research that I compiled, specifically, I want to highlight the Minnesota Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities. They have what's called their Parallels in Time project. And if you haven't looked at it yet, I really encourage you to do so. I learned a ton, and they've put a lot of work into making that available. And I also have more references and resources listed later on in this section. So I also, before I move on to perceptions and how we think about disability, I also think that, so we will go through these different models, so the charity, medical, social, and human rights, and I put them at different times on this continuum where I see, again, parallels in similarities, but also I want to note that even though there's these arrows and they're all pointing this way, that this really has not been a linear or this has not been a straight line of progression or evolution. So the charity model that we'll talk about, same with the medical model, is still very much all the way over here into the present and off the screen into 2020. So they're very much still with us today, and they inform, yeah, the way that we think about disability and how we even frame our program services, missions, philosophies, etc. I think that is it on that slide. So I will keep thinking and moving about onto perception. So in this section, we're going to take a moment to really, I keep saying it and I'll repeat it again, but we're going to really think about what we think about, which we don't really typically sit and take a moment to do that. So I think it's important though for us to consider why, for one, what we think about disability matters, what the consequences of how we think about disability, that those matter. And again, what frame of reference we use when at our jobs, working with people with disabilities, when we talk to people in our social circles about what we do, all of this matters. And we're going to dive into that shortly. So quickly, we are going to talk about perceptions, which for me, when I was saying perception is everything, I had to go back and look at the definition of perceptions. So I have some of those on the screen here. Most importantly is that beliefs turn into action. And I think that one reason why perception or beliefs are difficult to change is because, again, it's hard to really notice or locate exactly where we got them from along the socialization process, right? They're just kind of always there. They're these like unconscious like assumptions of things we hold to be true or real about something. So in this case, we're talking about disability or people with disabilities and how our actions are influenced by our understanding. And I think that for me, it's been really impactful again to learn these different models of disability. When I say models, I mean different frames of reference that have emerged from both academic research and non-academic writing and speaking by disabled and non-disabled people. So in this presentation and in all of the work I do, I really try to learn from and take the lead from disabled people themselves when talking about disability, because they are the experts of their lived experience of disability. And we will cover the models shortly, but there's many more than 4 different models of disability. So I think there's anywhere from about 9 to 10 that I know of, but for time's sake, we're going to focus on 4. And I think at the same time that we're centering the perspectives of people with disabilities, we're also allowing us space to learn about disability history, culture. It allows us to unpack, again, those beliefs or perceptions that we hold. And it also allows us to rethink our role and change the narrative about disability. So we're going to go on the next slide to this really fundamental shift that has happened between the charity model, the medical model, and then the fundamental shift happened at the social model of disability. So I want to take a second here to say that people with disabilities themselves were the people who led this fundamental shift in understanding. So it was people themselves who were speaking up, were writing about their experience, and they led this change. And I'm excited to be here today and to have this conversation with you, because I think that a lot of disability organizations, they either don't know about this, like that there's other ways that we can think about disability, or we just haven't caught up yet. So I'm really excited to talk about this topic today again. So I'll go quickly, and we can come back to this later if people have thoughts or want to discuss, but this was a graphic that I have found. I'll describe it for access purposes. So there's a person who is using what looks to be a wheelchair or a mobility aid, and they are positioned in front of a set of stairs. It looks like a staircase with a railing. And on the railing, it says the way in, and there's an arrow, and it says everyone welcome with an exclamation mark. So this person who's a wheelchair user is in front of a set of stairs that says everyone welcome, but there's no way that they can get up the stairs. So on the left, then there's a graphic that says the medical model of disability would understand this situation as saying that her impairment, the person's impairment, is the problem, and that she should be cured or be given prosthetics, maybe like an exoskeleton or something, to be able to walk up the set of stairs. But then the social model on the flip side says that the stairs are what is the problem here, and that we should build a ramp to be able to create access for this person without changing anything about how their body or their mind is made up. So I think that this, even though it's kind of like a cartoon graphic, for me, I was really thinking about that this shows that how we think about disability and people with disabilities has real world consequences and outcomes, either positive or negative, for people with disabilities, in being able to access their communities on an equal basis with other people. I will point out, and again, we can talk more about this later, but just this everyone welcome sign is really, it's very much a reflection, I think, of a lot of what we see, especially like in the media or just mainstream culture, when we hear things like the only disability in life is a bad attitude, or everyone welcome, like, but there's no access. So I'll also do a quick plug. We were just watching this at a training at LifeWorks, a TED Talk by Stella Young in 2014 that was talking about like inspiration porn, and again, this only disability in life is a bad attitude. She also talks about the social model in that talk, so highly recommend that. That was just on my mind. So we'll get into the nitty gritty here. of these different models of disability. And again, these are just like, they're kind of abstract conceptual models, how we think, but we're going to get later into how these actually really show up either in our personal lives, but also in our professional lives, serving people with disabilities and supporting employment first. So the charity model views disability pretty much as an individual tragedy. So I say, and I said earlier that the charity model is still really present today. And if you look at the media or media headlines, that is definitely very much true. So we often treat people with disabilities either as objects of pity or objects of inspiration. And that's coming from people with disabilities themselves that are talking about how they feel like they're often portrayed. I've learned a lot from the labor and research that has been done by the National Black Disability Coalition. And some of their resources are also listed in this references section that I've put together at the end of this presentation. But the National Black Disability Coalition says that from tragedy stems pity, and from pity stems a culture of care. And so I've been thinking a lot about how different a culture of care is than a culture of rights. So just something to think about as we move forward with thinking about perception. So then the medical model holds that the problems that are associated with disability reside within the individual, not with society. So if the disability is treated or fixed or cured, then any problems would go away. And both the medical and the charity model, excuse me, the medical and the charity models have historically been the most common ways in which non-disabled people have conceptually understood disability. So on the flip side of that, and we kind of saw that in the graphic, the social model made really important steps in understanding how we think about disability when we understand that people are disabled by the social barriers of the environment they live in and not by the features of their individual bodies and minds. So the social model focuses really on access barriers that are created by mainstream society. And the human rights model exists because of the progress that was made by the social model when it was first articulated around the 1980s. So the human rights model asserts that people with disabilities have the same civil, political, economic, and social rights as everyone else in society. And it also places accountability on governments and different actors, decision makers, policy makers to take action in upholding equal rights. So here, I think that this definition is really important to remember that it builds on the social model. So social barriers must be broken down, they must be removed. But even if you do that and you don't take further action, people with disabilities still might not be. This is the same with other groups too, right? Like the definition of equity as compared to equality. Even if social barriers are removed, a range of supports might still be needed, is likely still needed in order for people with disabilities to access their rights on an equal basis as non-disabled people. So the human rights model acknowledges that, again, these barriers in society are only one part of the puzzle. And we'll talk about kind of the differences, right? So there's 4 models that we're talking about here. And the one underlying philosophy that we see in the charity and medical models is that people with disabilities are dependent on society. So these, and this is again, I have down here, adapted from the National Black Disability Coalition. So they said that when we have this one fundamental assumption, that this can lead to negative actions and other assumptions such as paternalism, segregation, and discrimination. However, disability can be framed and understood in a positive way, thinking that people with disabilities are equal members of society. And this one can lead to more positive assumptions and actions, such as choice, empowerment, and equality of rights. And I also liked what the National Black Disability Coalition, they also talked about this equal members notion. They also called it customers of what society has to offer. So we can, and I think a lot of times we have thought of people with disabilities as being dependent, but we can also think about and understand and acknowledge that people with disabilities are equal members or equal customers of what society has to offer. And speaking of customers, I think, oh, yep, Ed Roberts says consumer pool. So I found this quote from the late Ed Roberts. And if you haven't learned a lot about him, I definitely recommend you look him up, look his story up, and be thinking about all the ways in which he really pioneered the way for where we're at today. So he was a disability rights activist in the 60s and 70s. And he said, we can only be really free and take our place in this society if we have economic freedom, which means careers. I remember when we used to talk to employers about hiring people with disabilities like it was a moral issue. It was a charitable thing to do. Now we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we have converted our approach from asking to be hired out of sympathy to marketing ourselves as a significant employee pool and a consumer pool as well. This is the legacy of the disability civil rights movement. And I just think that aside from just being really powerful and again, grounding in why I do the work that I do, is I think this is a really great example of the difference that disability rights makes in moving us away from the charity model or the moral model of disability and towards more just equity and achievement of equal rights and dignity for people with disabilities. Now go across these pretty quickly, but I wanted to put on here a couple differences in how we view disability. So again, highlighting just this really sharp contrast between the medical and social model. So here on the screen, in the center of the circle, it says the impairment is the problem. And there's kind of 6 other shapes and circles that are surrounded by it with entities or individuals or professions that have been thought to be a solution to this problem of individual impairments. And I do want to say here that the medical model is different from healthcare. So when we're saying, when we have therapists and doctors in one of these slides, we're not automatically being critical of all medical professionals who serve people with disabilities. So that's definitely not what I'm talking about here. I've gotten questions about that before. We know that medical professionals play a really important and necessary role in the lives of both people with disabilities and non-disabled people. But what we've been really talking about is that there's no reason why both health professionals, but also we see here social workers. Maybe some might say, and we can have a conversation later, do we put ourselves in one of these shapes too, like depending on the reason for which our roles were created. So it's a different, an interesting conversation we could have. So again, we're not being overly critical of these roles. We're just saying that there's also not a reason why they have to subscribe to the medical model of disability. So they, both medical professionals and human service professionals, we can operate within the social or human rights model of disability. And in fact, we might actually have a greater responsibility to play in really trying to dismantle the harms that have been done by either intentionally or unintentionally operating within this medical model of disability. So next, again, to have this contrast, the social model focuses on barriers to inclusion that are created by mainstream society. So the problem is not people with disabilities. The problem is a society which was literally not structured for people with disabilities in mind. And so we have here on the outside of this diagram, social structures that are problematic and create barriers for disabled people. These are some things like stigma and fear, segregation, inaccessible policies, cultural beliefs, and ableism and social prejudice. And I have a quote here that is, actually I have two quotes about ableism. And I really like this one because it's kind of not as academic as I've seen other ones. This one is just real life. This is the devaluation of disability that results in societal attitudes that uncritically assert that it is better for a child to walk rather than to roll or to use a wheelchair. That it is better for a child to speak rather than use sign language, to read print rather than read Braille, and so on and so forth. So this is what we're referring to really when we start to dig into ableism and how it really creates barriers to inclusion for people with disabilities in a lot of aspects of life. And I have another one here that says, it's by Maria Palacios. She has a poem called Naming Ableism. And she said, ableism is you feeling like I should be grateful for the ramps and the parking spaces as if access was not a basic right. So I think this quote shows really a stark difference between the outdated or the problematic models of disability, such as the charity model that might see, like people should be grateful that they have access, or people should be grateful that they have a job, right? Like if we're talking about employment, which we'll tie it back to here shortly. But also just talking about like access is a basic right, and like that understanding is really a fundamental shift in how we view accessibility and inclusion. And so in other presentations, my team and I at LifeWorks have defined ableism as a system of practices and belief that really assign inferior value to people with disabilities. And that ableism treats non-disabled people as the standard of, quote, normal living. So I think the other thing that I will mention on this slide is that the social model, again, was super important and a really critical shift in understanding that was led by people with disabilities. But it's kind of a fact, or it could be seen as like a passive kind of mindset. Like, okay, if people are disabled by society, that's a really important understanding, but shouldn't we tie it to something bigger? And I think that the human rights model, tying that to action or to live out that fact of the social model with action, I think that's an important piece that the disability rights model offers us. So I will go very quickly because I'm looking at time. I do have a couple slides on disability activism for civil rights, but I do want to leave time for questions. And I want to get us to a point where we can think about how these different models show up in our work that we do every day. So I'll go through these very quickly. We've got some pictures up here about, again, the activism that I talked about earlier. That happened really in the 70s and all the way through the 90s. Again, we can talk about them more in the questions and answers if you have any. I also will move quickly through just this kind of taking us beyond the US. So I have focused on the US context for the most part, But the disability rights go much farther beyond that. So there's actually been international treaties that have been written, international human rights laws that have been written. One that's cited down here is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that was passed at the United Nations in 2008. So it's like one of the newest and most recent human rights treaties that we have. And that was created by disabled activists from all around the world who came together, and they wrote out and argued and debated what different rights they should put into this international law. So there's about 32 or 33 total. I just have 3 listed here because I really think that it relates to the work of supporting employment first, specifically the right to work and employment on an equal basis with others. So just something cool to think about, and tie it again, just kind of like this is a lot of the work that we do, but we don't really think about it as doing human rights work. So again, I went through that very quickly. But when we look at disability rights and the social model frameworks, we can understand that disability is a normal part of the human experience and that it's a natural reflection of diversity and variation of people. So this has been important for me to think about, like when we understand disability in this way, why wouldn't people with disabilities have the right to access and participate in competitive employment of their choosing, for example, on an equal basis with non-disabled people? So I want us to take a few moments just in our heads, be reflecting on how these models might show up in the work that we do. I was going to ask us to take a time to type in the chat box, but for time's sake, just be thinking of in your head some of the ways that they might show up. I have a couple examples of my own that I came up with that are either real examples, like this first one with the charity model, that have happened and that I've experienced, more like conceptual, ways of thinking. So we've been thinking on my team the ways that the medical model kind of ties into funding and licensing requirements, and other models of disability that we didn't have time to talk about here, such as the expert professional model. Also the social model though. So these different models have the potential, even if we're not seeing them a lot, maybe we're able to come up with more examples of the medical or the charity model in the work that we do, but it doesn't have to stay that way. We can work towards a future where we would more easily be able to say, oh yeah, that's an example of the social model at work, or that's an example of the human rights model in the work that we do. And I have here for us some reflection questions if we're going to be able to incorporate the social or human rights models into our work. We have to engage in some critical self-reflection. So these are some examples of reflection questions. These are adapted from, I have in the references again, Alicia McCullough's work on the 7 models of whiteness. And I just changed some wordings and applied them really to these models of disability. And so lastly, as we're wrapping up, I really think that tying it back to the title and going back to this metaphor of breaking up with these old models, I have up here, break up with, it's time to break up with the medical and charity models, these outdated ways of thinking. And we need to move on to and get together with the social and human rights models. But we do really need to make sure that I could take this metaphor on and on and on and say things like, but it can't just be a rebound to the social and human rights model, or we can't just flirt with the social and human rights model. These models and changes in the ways that we think take a really long-term commitment to more equitable philosophies of service design and delivery, and they require some really hard conversations and ongoing conversations that we need to have internally, as professionals in our organizations and within our sector at large. And as I'm wrapping up, I know that this is a lighthearted metaphor, but I also still want to convey the real seriousness and the disservice that society does to people with disabilities by choosing not to kind of break up with these problematic ways of thinking about disability. So in closing, the charity model and the medical model of disability still exists today, but we know that it does not have to be this way. And that it's really time for us to break up with outdated beliefs about disability, especially within disability services ourselves. So that is all I've got. And I know we only have a couple of minutes, but if anyone had any questions that have come through in the Q&A, I'm happy to take them, or also before we leave, I'll advance on to my contact information. So feel free to reach out. So thank you all very much. And I've been really honored to be with you here today.
Allie, thank you so much for that really insightful and thought-provoking presentation. I think that there was something in there to all of us and how we are perceiving and thinking about disability and the people that we support. So thank you so much. This is one of those situations I really wish we could be together in person, because I think there was a lot in there that would really allow for some good conversation, which is really challenging to do over Zoom. But yeah, if anyone does have any questions or comments that they want to add before you all leave for the rest of your day, please submit that in the chat or in the Q&A. And we'll just hang tight and wait to see if anything comes in.
Yeah.
All right, it does look like it's 1 o'clock.
Mhm.
So Allie, if we can stick around for another minute or two, because sometimes something
Yeah.
last minute as people are typing, but otherwise, thank you very much everyone for joining us today. Hopefully you can join us again on Thursday for our 4th session. No, next Tuesday. I'm on the wrong day here. Next Tuesday for our 5th session in the conference, which Sean Roy from Transcend, you may recognize the name, Sean used to be at Pacer Center, will be presenting on using discovery tools to better engage families. So hopeful to see many of you there next week, and hope you have a great weekend.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.